Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Sajjad. You raised the bar. Really. I don't know if I can't live up to that, but it's lovely to be here. Thank you for organizing this, Vinay. So the paper I offer today is at an exploratory stage. My ultimate goal is to investigate the relationship between two observations. The first about Ibn Arabi, the medieval Spanish Sufi figure that Sajjad introduced, and the second about Safavid Shi'i responses to Ibn Arabi. More specifically, my investigation concerns Sharia in an imaginative system that often negates distinctions between God and creation. Since Safavid philosophers admired Ibn Arabi and cited him, and were dominated by what we could call a fiqhi perspective very often, how did they manage this element of his thought? After all, non-duality has long seemed to imply an amoral position, or, in the case of traditions focused on law, an antinomian one. If everything is one, then everything is good. Or, as implied in the name given to antinomian Sufis, al-Ibahiyya, everything is legally neutral and thus permissible. The British Orientalist Robert Charles Zaehner saw Islam as originating in, quote, a conception of God as wholly distinct from his creation. Thus, to Zaehner, the impulse to non-duality was so foreign that he traced non-duality to one particular disruptive figure, Bayezid Bastami. Bayezid Bastami of the 9th century. He believed Bastami to have been exposed to Vedantin conceptions, which, once introduced to Islam, changed it forever. Certainly Zaehner, who wrote that in 1960, offers a historical explanation lacking the nuance of contemporary Sufi studies. Yet fascinatingly, Safavid thinkers opposed to theoretical and antinomian Sufism, such as Muhammad Tahir Qumi, will repeatedly refer to dangerous Sufis as, quote, Sunni followers of Hallaj and Bayezid. Not only were such Sufis outside the circle of normative Shi'i Islam for Qumi, but they carried with themselves the earliest heretical positions of the two most famous drunk Sufis, Hallaj and Bayezid, drunk because of their open declaration of the secret that God and creation are one. Of course, over 3 centuries later, at the time of Ibn Arabi, matters have become more complex. Philosophy has now emerged. Theology has responded to philosophy, adapted much of it. Sufism is finding itself. It's a science now. It's really an institution. This means that Ibn Arabi's ideas often hide beneath a technical vocabulary and references, intertextual references, making them hard to grasp at first glance, or making the non-duality often very hard to grasp. Hence, in the case of the antinomian potential for non-duality, Ibn Arabi will often disappoint those looking to convict. As Omar Adeybat and others have discussed, Ibn Arabi was a master Sunni legal scholar, with mostly Zahiri opinions, but a great deal of originality. At first glance, aside from a certain hermeneutical literalism, little in his jurisprudence is explicitly related to the oneness of being or his other theoretical doctrines. Yet that literalism turns out to be a fundamental principle in his thought. It holds together his treatment of the various Islamic sciences. The world in which humans come to know God has been formulated through an act of revelation, a divine effusion of words. From the emanation of God's names to the niceties of Islamic law, everything goes back to those divine words. All things emanate from God's speech, from God's being, and thus, in a way, yes, all things are good. These two ideas, Ibn Arabi's literal reading of Sharia and his leveling of all things as ultimately good, results in what might be called an ontological embrace of Ash'ari voluntarism. That is, Sharia for Ibn Arabi reflects divine desire, irada, as an ordering of things, the creation of a network of preferences. It is, we could say, a simulation that allows humans to enjoy what is deemed good by seeing in it qualities different from what has been deemed bad. Thus, they know the world in this enjoyable way, enjoyable because it allows them to love certain things, dislike other things, and it creates order for them. Through it, they find a means to their perfection. The implications of this view pose no danger to the norms of Sharia as long as one accepts Ibn Arabi's worldview as a whole, including and especially his legalistic literalism. The Sharia always has a place in Ibn Arabi's thought because God's obligating command is as much a reflection of God's knowledge as God's creative command. Moreover, Ibn Arabi presents each Sharia, the Sharia of all the different prophets, as manifestations of those prophets themselves, of their physical constitutions, actually. And those prophets are human reflections of God and his attributes. So every prophet is a personalized and distinct manifestation of the complete human. And this is the important part, that includes the saints, that includes the awliya too, among which Ibn Arabi numbers himself. This means that a saint's preferences matter as well, for they share in human perfection in a way similar to the prophets. So now, once I consider this, and I know there's a lot there, and that's why in a way this is an exploratory project. This is kind of two papers, but they're bridged. I'd like to proceed to explore the reception in Safavid Shi'i thought. The Safavid period was a fascinating time for the reception of Ibn Arabi. You could say that it shaped the course of Shi'i Islam. You could also say that it shaped the course of what we might call a school of Ibn Arabi's thought, the Mullah Sadra's interpretation of Ibn Arabi. At this stage, my research is tentative, but one thing that struck me at this initial stage was how nuanced some of these Safavid readers were. I had thought them to be dismissive. I had thought them to be simple, naive when it came to Ibn Arabi. They're not. They're not generous in an intellectual sense, but they're reading the text. And I ultimately think, and this is my thesis right now, that the incompatibility sensed by Safavid critics of Ibn Arabi does actually indicate an awareness of this larger point about Sharia that I'm trying to make, that they were aware of this. It's not to say that Ibn Arabi is incompatible with Shi'i Islam, but that the framework of his teachings do not suit the model of Sharia that many Safavid scholars held dear, and I think still predominates Shi'i, 12 or Shi'i thought today. Okay, so Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi's awareness of his distinct interpretation of Sharia appears in a moment that he knew would be recorded in history. When Ibn Arabi met with Muhibb ad-Din ibn al-Najjar in Baghdad, the terms were clear. Ibn al-Najjar was a historian who was conducting an interview with Ibn Arabi to basically record him in his book in the history of Baghdad. Ibn Arabi offered the historian something. He offered him a poem. And it's recorded in Ibn al-Najjar's account. It's also affixed to the biography of Ibn Arabi that's in the Futuhat, in al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah. And this is my translation of the poem. O you bewildered at the discrepancy between knowledge and appetite, shahwa, hoping that these two opposites become connected firmly. Yet he who has never inhaled the fragrance will have never known the virtue of freshly drawn musk over dung. So the final bait refers to the way in which one removes musk from a deer, reaching for the gland between the genitals and a point at the abdomen, the umbilical, where the umbilical cord would be. So dung would be proximate to that area, and the two are, you could say, anatomical neighbors. Ibn Arabi uses these lines to explain one of the key ambiguities that seems to have surrounded him wherever he went. The ambiguity was in the veneration of the world and worldly beauty that inhered in Ibn Arabi's thought. After all, Ibn Arabi was sort of put on trial, you could say, for publishing a book of erotic poetry. The stories surrounding him highlighted a freewheeling approach to pleasure and to the prophetic sunnah, even when those stories were fabricated. Some, Ibn Arabi declares in these lines, hope that two things, the first being knowledge, ilm, and the second appetite or lust, shahwa, might be united or brought together. Yet the love of beautiful things must be extracted from the ugly, much like musk is extracted from the gland of the deer. One must be aware of the ordering of things, knowledgeable about what has value. One must make such distinctions in order to leave aside that which does not have value. Just as the knower of God, the recognizer of God, the arif, leaves aside appetite for knowledge even when he delights in worldly affairs, or she delights in worldly affairs. This view is substantiated by the fact that elsewhere, Ibn Arabi makes clear that the lower world, ad-dunya, is dung, zibal, on account of, he says, the natural heat within it which causes it to be decayed. That's from the Futuhat, that quote. That's not from the context of the poem. The implication is that we live in a world where all things are mixed, and only certain enlightened souls can help us differentiate between what should and should not be desired. This is the core of Sharia for Ibn Arabi. Now remember, the Prophet can make such distinctions, but Ibn Arabi can make such distinctions too. The most famous passage in which Ibn Arabi considers scent and good taste as intrinsically related to Sharia is probably familiar to many of you if you've read the Fusus al-Hikam. It's the last chapter of Fusus al-Hikam. There, Ibn Arabi clarifies that the Prophet's likes and dislikes, we could say the Prophet's preferences, have imitative and even legislative potential. Why? Because of the care with which he expresses his preferences while still acknowledging the goodness of all things. This is in his statement about garlic. Ibn Arabi makes clear it depends on the Prophet. This comes from the Prophet's perfect constitution. So the goodly, a tayyib, was made beloved of the Prophet instead of the vile, al-khabith. And so his dislike of garlic resembles that of the angels, whose distance from earthly affairs make them turn against that which smells of rot, or in the case of onions, a sulfuric smelling root taken from the belly of the earth. This is because constitutions differ, such that according to Ibn Arabi, the rose does not have a goodly fragrance for the dung beetle. And whoever has such a constitution in meaning or in form is harmed by what is real whenever he hears it and delights in what is invalid. Ibn Arabi compares the bad taste, you could say, of the dung beetle to the willful ignorance of those who cannot hear the truth. Both result from a nature that inheres in one's constitution. This also means that the ability to appreciate revelation is an aesthetic affair. Those with the most refined tastes after the Prophet Muhammad are the saints who embody his wisdom. I hope it's clear what I'm trying to say. So now I'm going to keep tracing this dung beetle analogy, and there were examples I couldn't bring in here. I've been following the dung beetle everywhere in Ibn Arabi's work. And there's a lot of dung beetle. So the dung beetle also appears, and it's important.
There's a lot of dung.
Yeah. So my next one is from Futuhat al-Makkiyah, not Fusus. And this passage in particular is quoted prevalently by Safavid philosophers. This passage in particular comes up a lot. While the Fusus, even though the Fusus example I mentioned should be mentioned more often, that's more well known. But this is the one that they mention, and that's the key to what I'm trying to say today. So here he's also going to use the argument about taste. It's a long passage, I'm sorry, but it's all up here. Okay, I'll read it, but you can read it up there too. So he's talking about the damned, and by the way, before this he mentions an opinion of Abu Medyan. He mentions that the standard view is that people go to hell and live there forever. Now he wants to disagree politely with his teachers, and this is what he says. he, the wrongdoer, will indeed receive a punishment of pain equivalent to the duration of his life spent in idolatry, shirk, in this world. But once that period of time is complete, comfort will be arranged for them in the fire, for were they to enter paradise, they would suffer because of the lack of correspondence with their constitutions, which God has arranged for them. God has given them a certain constitution. Thus they take pleasure in what they occupy, in terms of fire, severe frost, as well as stinging snakes and scorpions, just as the people of paradise take pleasure in shade, light, as well as kissing beautiful houris, because their constitutions have determined such. Do you not see the dung beetle in this world has a constitution that is harmed by the scent of the rose and takes pleasure in the malodorous? Such is the case of the one who was created with the dung beetle's constitution. And there do occur such constitutions in this world, as we ourselves have witnessed. So he says the dung beetle's constitution makes it suited for what is putrid, makes it suited for dung. A beautiful constitution, however, makes it suited for what is lovely, fragrant, and like that constitution, beautiful. Aligning oneself with the Prophet Muhammad's preferences brings one to be aligned with the Prophet's constitution. This matters because things in the world all make manifest God and his attributes. All are good. So ranking only appears in preferences. God has preferences. Muhammad has preferences. And God has preferred the Prophet Muhammad's preferences. This gives the Prophet's preferences imitative and, as I have said, legislative potential that reflects the way things will be ordered in the hereafter. In the hereafter, those who prefer the ugly and the disgusting will cease to be punished. Instead, they will be allowed to take pleasure in those vile things, which is what they have always wanted. So, what I'm saying is that this brings with it the implication of what he's also saying about Sharia, that Sharia is like this too. But let's turn to the Safavids. The Safavids clearly had reservations when it came to the Sufis and Ibn Arabi. We know this. The most extreme antagonism appears in the Tuhfatul Akhyar of Muhammad Tahir Qumi. Qumi describes Ibn Arabi as having been infatuated by his stepson, the beautiful Sadruddin Qurawi. And the boy at one point becomes embarrassed by Ibn Arabi because of rumors of heresy and drives the sheikh mad by returning to his own home for a few days. Qumi's interest in the pederastic proclivities of Ibn Arabi have no historical basis whatsoever. But to me, they do seem to stem from a concern over antinomianism. An antinomianism that in Safavid Iran was related to the oneness of being and was associated with Sufis. Antinomianism was the main issue associated with dervishes and false Sufis. This is discussed by Atta Anzali in his book. And even those who revered Ibn Arabi, Mullah Sadra, for example, in his Kasra Islam al-Jahiliyyah, when it comes to identifying false Sufis, do so by describing those who were, quote, imprisoned by the fetters of lust. So lust is an issue. Mullah Sadr, however, seems consistent in mentioning Ibn Arabi's name with the highest praise in the Asfar. He refers to him as the exemplar of the unveilers, quote, the perfect sheikh, among the sheikhs truly declaring God's oneness, the recognizing deific sheikh and the sublime sheikh, may God sanctify his innermost heart. But what about Sharia? In Shawahid al-Rububiyyah, Mullah Sadr calls on Ibn Arabi and once again borrows the dung beetle commentary to describe the people of the hereafter. He quotes the passage from chapter 289 of the Futuhat al-Makkiyah that I quoted earlier, word for word. He does it again in Asfar, but only insofar as it applies to the hereafter. So either Mullah Sadr veered from Ibn Arabi's view of Sharia as also a matter of prophetic taste, or he could not bring himself to cite it openly. In either case, I haven't been able to locate in Mullah Sadr's writings. And I should say, because I've cut this, that part of that taste has to do, for example, with the love of women and perfume as well. If you know the full hadith, 3 things have been made beloved of me. And those become part of the prophetic sunnah and therefore part of the Sharia. I've argued this elsewhere. Mullah Sadr's student, Faiz Kashani, held a much more complex view of Ibn Arabi. And you can see this in Bisharat al-Shi'a, a text composed in 1670, around 9 years before Faiz's death, and available currently to us only in manuscript form. And this is the quote. I'm sorry, this one too is kind of long. I'll let you read it. Maybe I'll point out some key sentences. I'll read parts of it. So, whoever is not upon the path of the Ahlul Bayt, protected from error, purified from filth, is not guided to their walaya, has certainly erred and gone astray. Even, and look at what he's saying here. He's saying two things are possible at once. Even if he surpasses others in the religious sciences and modes of ma'rifah, of recognition. This greatest sheikh of theirs, when he says of theirs, he means the Sunnis. That's how I'm taking it, because it's called Basharat Shia. Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, who is among the chiefs of their brand of Sufism and among the leaders of their sort of Arif, says in his Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah that I have never asked God to make known to me the Imam of my time, and if I were to do so, I would ask that he make known myself to me. Ponder upon this, O you who've been granted vision, since he considers himself free from need with respect to this knowledge, although he has heard the hadith that the person who dies without knowing the Imam of their age dies in a death of Jahiliyyah, which is well known among all the religious scholars. See how God has abased him, abandoned him, banished him. Devils have lured him to be bewildered, lost in the land of religious sciences, such that despite the abundance of his knowledge, and look at the contradictions in this sentence, the precision of his perspective, despite his traversing in the land of realities, his understanding of mysteries and subtleties, he has no firm footing in, look at what he says, the various branches of ulum al-shari'ah, the Sharia. Nor has he clenched anything of knowledge with the piercing tooth of certainty. Among his words is that which blatantly goes against the revealed law, ash-shara', and clearly opposes reason itself, that which children would mock, pardon me for the misogyny here, women deride, as is apparent to anyone who follows closely his writings, especially Al-Futuhat, particularly, and look at this, that which he mentions in the chapters of the secrets of worshipful acts, again Sharia. So, I think I can leave the rest, but I think the last sentence here is worth reading. Sometimes he says something of certainty and immutable truth, while at other times he makes statements frailler than the spider's web. So Faiz will continue to describe in this text Ibn Arabi as an ascetic, a zahid, taken away at times by his own rigorous practices, interpreting the abstract forms that result from such exercises as absolutely real when such is not always the case. He's under a kind of delusion that comes from his irfan, from his ma'rifah. You notice what he's saying. He's saying that the only way to properly interpret what the Arif sees, and he says this, is through the Ahlul Bayt and the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt. And to make that point, he quotes a person that I don't know, Sajjad, you might know him, Qutbuddin Muhyiddin al-Kushkinari. I don't know him. Commenting that whenever an unveiling contradicts revelation, one can know that the wayfarer in question has been entered by Satan and that his unveiling was infirm. So Ibn Arabi is not, according to Faiz, worthy of the name Shaykh al-Akbar or by the epithets that Mullah Sadra gave to him, because in the end he's failed to grasp what will rescue a person in the hereafter, the exclusive walaya of the Ahlul Bayt, the position of Ali, the position of the Imams. So this is what leads Ibn Arabi to strange positions that have no firming in Sharia. Again, Sharia disqualifies Ibn Arabi from sainthood for Faiz. Now, I'm closing here, I'm wrapping it up, but the dung beetle analogy, Faiz, again, like Mullah Sadra, probably in imitation of Mullah Sadra, he'll quote the same passage from 289 of Futuhat al-Makkiyah. He quotes it in a number of places. Al-Kalimat al-Makhzuna, it's in his Mirat al-Akhirah, and in Mirat al-Akhirah, he devotes the end of the entire treatise to Ibn Arabi, which is a big deal. The whole treatise is on the hereafter for Faiz, and he goes with Ibn Arabi's reading of the hereafter, mostly this chapter 289 that I quoted. He cites it in Anwar al-Hikmah. He cites it in Ayn al-Yaqeen, an important book for Faiz, Ayn al-Yaqeen. In all of these cases, Ibn Arabi's observations offer Faiz what I would say a wujudi perspective on the distribution of just desserts in the hereafter. None of them, however, includes a discussion of the Sharia, the Prophet's own constitutions, or the preferences that have determined God's revealed ordering of this in this world. So let me just do I have like a minute just to conclude? Okay. So now I'm going to step back a minute and just think about this. The contradictions that Safavid thinkers noticed in Ibn Arabi's writings do seem to reflect a real disparity. Ibn Arabi's insistence that the world is best interpreted, ranked, and enjoyed by those most awakened to the real always included himself and other post-Muhammad saints as those interpreters. For Ibn Arabi, moreover, such sainthood was not restricted to the 12 Imams, nor do they seem to have any special claim to that sainthood that Ibn Arabi himself would lack, at least not as far as I can tell. Living saints form a network to which a person can aspire, realize within themselves, and then use to rank and order the effects of creation in a manner like the Prophet Muhammad himself. Again, framed by the Prophet Muhammad, but still individual. Thus, one's own preferences can have legislative value if one qualifies as an arif, a recognizer, and a saint. That is, one can become sensitive to what is good and beautiful and create practices that the Safavids, including Faiz, considered innovations. Contemporary Shi'i clergy seem to agree on this matter, so that what might sometimes seem to be a naive conservatism actually reflects an awareness of a deeper hermeneutical divide. Perhaps such difference can lead to a dialectic in which Ibn Arabi functions as more than merely a precursor and forebear to the philosophy of Mullah Sadra. The Shi'i Usuli approach has managed to maintain tradition through jurisprudence and the study of scripture. Nevertheless, there might be room for an imaginative exploration of Sharia as reflecting something in reality beyond divine commands. This is not to say that Ibn Arabi was right or wrong, but rather that his thought offers any Islamic tradition the opportunity to consider the nature of revealed prohibitions and injunctions within the context of an awakening. That awakening involves, among other things, realizations about God that occur through human experiences. And realizing God through human experiences is, to a degree, one way we might describe Sharia. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyrus. What we're going to do is we're going to take the Q&A after each talk. So so we have until half past for this. So I think Nizam has a question. We'll take each question one by one, just because it's sometimes a bit of a hassle clustering them.
Yeah.
So we'll start with Nizam, and Vinay has a question as well.
Do you want? Sure. Oh, you guys. Oh, yeah. Here, I got you. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I just have a quick comment and then a comment question, both. The first comment is when you didn't quote the hadith from chapter 27 of the Fusus.
No.
You sort of said it in English, and you said three things were made love to me. But it's very important because the actual text doesn't say that. It says, حُبِّبَ إِلَيَّ مِن دُنْيَاكُمْ. The key point is مِن دُنْيَاكُمْ. حُبِّبَ إِلَيَّ مِن دُنْيَاكُمْ ثَلَاثٌ النِّسَاء وَالطِّيبُ وَجُعِلَتْ قُرَّةُ عَيْنِي فِي الصَّلَاةِ. So the key part is that I was, three things of your world, you people, were made beloved to me. Women, and he says it in this order, fragrance or perfume, and the coolness of my eyes was placed in the prayer. Just, it's a minor point.
It's fine.
Yeah, because that dunyakum part I think is very important. It's referring to the world in the context of everything else you said. I think it's pretty important. This little phrase here, I don't know what the Arabic is, but I mean, you're quoting it from the Futuhat. I have never asked God to make known to me the imam of my time, etc., etc. I really wonder if that's really so problematic. Did Faiz really? And again, I don't know. These guys say different things at different times, and Faiz is not an exception. But I would just like to call to your attention, because in the school of Ibn Arabi, in the Akbari tradition, they're very, very, very interested in Umar ibn Farid. And there's a very important line from the Ta'iyya Ta'iyat al-Suluk, or the poem of the way, Nazm al-Suluk, the Sufi way rhyming in the letter Ta, where he says, and I quote, إِلَيَّ رَسُولًا مِنِّي كُنْتُ مُرْسَلًا وَذَاتِي بِآيَاتِي عَلَيَّ اسْتَدَلَّتِ. I mean, that is really something. So he says, Ilayya, to my very self, Rasulan, a messenger, was I sent, minni, from myself, dispatched, sent forth from myself, wadati bi-ayati, and my very essence, my very self, by its signs or portents, alayya stadallati, points back to me. And I think that in the light of the essence of the Fusus al-Hikam and the opening paragraph of the Fusus al-Hikam and the concept of al-Insan al-Kamil, and in as much as that the Insan al-Kamil is also the Imam of the age, he's referring to that, Wallahu a'lam.
To the Imam of the age.
Well, I mean,
you could stick with it.
I mean, the reality of the Imam, right? There's this idea of these things taking place within you.
So you think Ibn Farid is referring to the reality of the Imam?
Why not? Why not? And there is this idea, of course, ironically, it's from Simnani, kind of an adversary of Wahdatul Wujud, but the idea of the prophets of inner being. So there is a Muhammad in your inner being that must come and destroy the idols in the Kaaba of the heart. And the Quran says, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So I mean, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ, and indeed there has come unto you prophet from yourself. Now they'll interpret it, not that in the ta'wil sense, but in these, sarih al-ibara, or whatever you want to say. Well, it's from among you, you, the Arabs, Quraysh, what have you. But I would take it in that sense, and that's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's a legitimate reading of what Ibn Arabi could have been saying. That I don't need to be made. The Imam is here. He's saying that the Imam is within me, right?
The Imam is within you.
Yeah. Now, why Faiz doesn't read it that way, I don't know.
Sadr did.
Do you want to? Dr. Lawson.
Of course, Mullah Sadr did.
Yeah.
And Ibn Arabi in another place, connected to the Sharia, in the Futuhat, says very clearly that the perfection of your salat culminates in God appointing your heart as Imam. It's clear as a bell. So there's no ambiguity about this at all. I mean, it's indefinite Imam, but it's enough.
Yeah.
So I think that this is.
I think we have two mics. You can. Cyrus,
well, let me just comment on this real quick, and then here, you can take this one off. Will I get feedback if I bring these close together, or just carry this like this?
Yeah, just carry that.
Okay, this one can be kind of for the people.
For the people, yeah.
Okay. So just to comment real quickly, I think what both of you are kind of pointing to, and this is something I'd like to hear Sajjad talk about if possible. I mean, it seems to me quite possible that in the case of Mullah Sadra, and again, Sajjad, maybe you could take the mic and help us through this, but that in the case of Mullah Sadra, that there could be a bit of, he's being somewhat careful, but at the end of Faiz's life, he's being very careful. I mean, it seems to me that things really changed in Safavid Iran. Yeah, in the course of Faiz's life, it's a really important time. And if Ibn Arabi was, when he starts writing, when Faiz starts writing, a little unwelcome, by the end of Faiz's life in Safavid Iran, Muhammad Tahir Qumi has really given him a hard. He hasn't let him. He's been unrelenting, and others too. And so it's quite possible that the degree to which, let me rephrase this, the degree to which Faiz is being sincere here, I don't know. In other words, there could be a lot of, for lack of a better word, taqiyya here. It's possible. But my point is just that what seems to have been the issue is the Sharia. You got a question in the back? Yeah. And if Sajjad, if you want to comment.
Go ahead.
You pass the mic back.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alex.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. Sorry, I have some really basic questions. My first question is, sorry, there's 3 questions, but I think it's like one. My first question is, so are aesthetic preferences of, let's say, saints legislative for everyone or just for the saint? My second question is if there's any aesthetic preferences that are just trivial, like let's say Ibn Arabi like chocolate ice cream, like is that somehow legislative? And then my third question is, how would your aesthetic preferences relate to your conscience? Or does he, like, yeah, your moral conscience?
Those are actually really good questions. So let me answer the middle one first because that's the one that's fresh in my mind. There are no arbitrary preferences for Ibn Arabi. Okay, that's the point. Is that your preferences reflect your physical constitution. He seems to me to be extending on this model of the soul, where your physical constitution has this major effect on your soul, and so. This, in a way, is your reality and your means to perfection, and it would matter what you like and dislike. And Ibn Arabi talks about different moments in his life when when his taste would change, and for him, they all indicate something. So he talks about a moment in his life when he just, it wasn't a matter of taste, but he didn't eat, and it had to do with him consuming the divine love, and he was gaining weight, but he wasn't eating. But all these little details, matter. And they all reflect a larger reality. So that was the middle question. Now let me go back to the first one, which was? Was it legislative for everyone? Oh, legislative for everyone, that's a great question. So no, but it can be. So if you align yourself with the saint for whatever reason, or you've associated yourself with them either in person, or you've come to know their reality and you're taking guidance from them, then yes, it's something you could do and borrow. And so he'll make sense of certain practices that aren't what we would strictly speaking call sunnah, but they make sense because they've been verified by the practice of saint. And so morality, by the way, morality and aesthetics, if you want to call it that, are intimately related in Ibn Arabi's thought. So because, again, good and evil are matters of taste. He talks about this elsewhere. He talks about it in the ayah that has to do with the ifk. I'm not very good with Quran memorization, but the tayyibun, tayyibat, can someone maybe, do we have the Quran? Someone who has the Quran memorized here. Tayyibun li tayyibat, khabithin li khabithat, right? The goodly are for the goodly, and the vile are for the vile. And Ibn Arabi's reading of this particular ayah is that if you are a dung beetle type person, vile things are for you. You can call them evil, but God created them with a purpose. So you can call them evil, but you're just calling them evil. They are lower in terms of an awareness of reality than the good things, that's true. But they have a kind of goodness in them because that whole structure, it sits on, things sit on one another. You need the lower levels of the structure to have the higher levels of the structure. Yeah, sure. Okay. Did you want to comment, Sajjad, on this whole Safavid thing? I'd love to hear Sajjad's thoughts. I don't know if it's okay to do that.
You don't want to listen to it.
Yeah. I just had a technical question, perhaps. In how the ghulat are treated and the antinomianism of the ghulat, do Safavid scholars like Fayd al-Kashani or Tahir al-Qummi use ghulu or ghulat in regards to Akbarian Sufism? Because often antinomianism is classified under
the ghulat of Imam Ali and the Imams.
Yeah, I mean they're accused of doing all kinds of weird sexual perversions and things. We read all about that.
Yeah.
This is the accusations against the ghulat, right? And antinomianism, or this kind of anti-Sharia stance that they take. Is a similar language or categorization used with regards to Ibn Arabi or Akbarian Tasawwuf by Safavid scholars?
I haven't seen that. What I've seen more of is, it seems to me like Faiz, you can see in his career, he's still trying to redeem the term Sufi. Like you saw it in that passage, but he wants to separate the Sufi from the Sunni.
Okay.
And he ultimately fails because, at times of these books, we see what happens to the word Sufi in Shia circles. It's there today. I mean, when I speak to people who like study traditional Shi'i Islam and they say, well, what do you study? And I say Sufism. They're like, you mean Irfan, right? And I go, no, I actually mean Sufism. You know, I gotta be honest with you. Yeah. So you know, I think there was some attempt to try to extract it, extract it from Sunnism. So if there were any hints of ghulu in these writings, that would be a helpful thing. That would help him. That would help them make the case that this is a Shi'i Ahlul Bayt kind of science, as opposed to the other.
Do we have one last question? Someone else? Because we'll come back to you. You've got to talk at the end. Anyone else has one last question? Okay. Just one quick comment on what you said. So I think things changed from the middle of the 1660s. Up to that point, you have a context which is relatively supportive of Sufism. I don't believe Mullah Sadwa is dissimulating at all and holding back. It changes in the mid-60s after the death of Abbas II. And Tahir for me becomes more and more important. I mean, like, his harassment of Faiz is extremely well known. I mean, he basically had him driven out of town. He, in effect, had his, the Imam Jumayship of Isfahan rescinded and so forth. So I think something does change, and there's a broader context which changes. But once as long as you have people like Sheikh Buhari around and Mullah Sadwa and even Taqi Majlisi, it's a very different context.
Yeah.
But they do attack, as you said, antinomianism. But for them, antinomianism is associated with certain kinds of practices. So people who are naked or pierced, or sort of an extreme qalandari, malamati experience, which they say is associated with Sufi shrines, and even, of course, with the shrines in Mashhad and so forth. So I think that is
Good. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah.